Hello, good afternoon. Let's go to start this talk. Today we have the honor to have with us Professor Gordon Mathews from Hong Kong, Chinese University of Hong Kong. Professor Mathews is a cultural anthropologist, a North American cultural anthropologist based in Hong Kong. He's a specialist. He works on, his research interests are culture and identity, global culture, anthropological theory, meanings of life. And as geographical areas, he studies Japan, United States, Hong Kong, and Chungking Mansions. I'm really curious because you put as a geographic area Chungking Mansions, and I think that that's right because it's a geographic area. He has several publications. Among his publications, we can just to mention, Hong Kong, China, Learning to Belong to a Nation, Global Culture, Individual Identity, both in Routledge, What Makes Life Worth Living, published by Berkeley. And also edited books like Pursuits of Happiness, Well-Being and Anthropological Perspective, Japan's Changing Generations. We read one of your articles. It was translated into Spanish by Casa Asia House. We read in the second course of our grade. Professor Mathews today is going to talk about understanding Japanese society through life after death. So with no further ado, I will let Professor Mathews to talk about this topic. When you want.
Sure. Okay. No hablo catalán. Hablo un poquito español, pero no hablo español. Hablo japonés, hablo cantonés, pero yo inglés. Lo siento mucho. I'm extremely sorry to have to give this talk in English because I know for many of you it's your third or possibly fourth or possibly fifth language. Most of what I say is on PowerPoint. Don't worry about questions, which I hope there are many, because feel free to ask in any language you want. But I have to give this in English. Sorry. Today I'm talking about Japanese society as understood through life after death. Now, we don't know what happens after we die, because no one's ever come back from there. But we can imagine how we imagine what happens after we die is of great analytical importance. This has to do with practice theory, which is anthropological theory explaining how each individual creates society and society creates the individual. People like Berger and Luckman, Bourdieu, and Ortner show how even the most frivolous of individual imaginings are socially shaped and socially shaping. Those who hold them engage in and thereby help to create the social world around them. You guys create the university by coming here. You create this. If you weren't here, it wouldn't exist. Even your most private fantasies create the social world we're in. Now, one way to understand this is to look at Japan today. Consider Japanese NEETs and Parasaito Shinguru. NEETs are young Japanese who stay at home, who don't go to work, who don't go to school. Parasaito Shinguru are young Japanese who don't marry. Each one of these people does this for individual personal reasons. The young person who thinks, I don't want to work like my father, or I'm not interested. The young person who thinks, I don't want to get married, I'd rather live at home. This is a personal choice. But even though these are individual private matters, taken collectively by the millions, they have profound societal implications. If 30% of young Japanese don't have careers like their fathers or families like their mothers, the society is transformed. This is complicated because some young Japanese cannot find jobs or marriage partners. It's just like in Spain with high unemployment rates. But to the extent this is personal choice, this is what we see. The same is true for life after death. But unlike young people's life paths, individual imaginings of life after death have few obvious effects on society at large. If I think I'm going to heaven, or I think I die and nothing happens after I die, it might have no relation to my general behavior in society. So the relation between the individual and society can only be logically surmised. I can't prove this. I can only draw logical relations, but they're important. And the basic idea of my talk today is that what people think about life after death is directly related to how they think about the future of Japan. That's it. That's what I'm talking about. And I'll try to show how this is true. First, though, theoretical analysis of life after death in relation to the world before death. Most famously, you know Karl Marx, religion as the opium of the people, enabling the toiling proletariat to endure the oppressions of the world. The laborers labor away despite the fact they're oppressed because they dream of heaven in the next world. In a more detailed way, Max Weber, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, he wrote about how because a few Western Europeans in the 16th and 17th centuries thought that if they really worked and saved their money, they would go to heaven, or be shown they were going to heaven, they created, unwittingly, contemporary capitalism. So, their belief in life after death led eventually to the whole modern economic order, according to Weber. In this case, belief in life after death had a direct relation to the kind of world that evolved in the future. More recently, somebody like Ernest Becker wrote of how the loss of a sense of a world beyond this one has led human beings to seek significance in money or fame or nationalism. But today, very few scholars theoretically examine the relation of life after death to life before death, largely because this has become so individuated. You know, 200 or 300 years ago, people believed in a much more collective way, so that a given society, most people, would believe in heaven or hell, or in reincarnation, or in some other set of beliefs, depending upon their religious background. Today, it's become individuated, so it's become extremely difficult to analyze. I am beginning ethnographic research now in the long shadow of Max Weber, analyzing individual senses of life after death in the United States, China, and Japan, and their relation to these societies' global economic power. Can this be done? I don't know. But if you take the world's 3 biggest economies and look at what people privately believe about life after death, what does this tell us? The ultimate question is why people work so hard. Why do you work so hard if you're only going to die? An interesting question. Let me talk about the history of life after death in Japan. In medieval Japan, the Buddhist depiction of the cycles of birth and death, known as Rokudo, was dominant. And this held that you had a transmigration of humans upon death into gods, or humans, or asuras, or animals, or hungry ghosts, or creatures of hell. And everybody believed this in medieval Japan. Depending on how you lived in the world, you would go to one of these 6 realms. Everybody believed in this, but it was terrifying, according to William Lafleur, who wrote about this. So an alternative idea emerged, the idea that one could, through devotion or through dying in a state of right-mindedness, transcend the cycles of birth and death and be transported directly to the paradise of Pure Land. This was the appeal of Jodo Shinshu, the Pure Land Buddhism, that by properly giving expressing your relation to the Amida Buddha, your devotion to the Amida Buddha, you could then be in the Pure Land, in heaven, and never have to go through this transmigration of the 6 cycles. The Pure Land offered by Shin Buddhism came to be seen by many as a realm where one could rejoin deceased family members. And so in this way, Japanese Buddhism became tightly interlinked with ancestor veneration or ancestor worship. This was in very great contrast to Rokudo, because in ancestor worship or ancestor veneration, your ancestors take care of you and you take care of them, your descendants after you die. Whereas in Rokudo, it's individual. Your fate depends entirely on how you live in this world, and no one else can help you. So these have 2 very different implications you can see. In ancestor veneration, where exactly the ancestors are has never been fully clear. Are the ancestors off in the Pure Land? Are the ancestors in the mountains over there? Are they hanging out around the house? Well, no one really knows, and it's not very important. What is important is the emotional linkages. That's what's really key, then, I think, and now as well. Now, over the past 150 years, there has been increasing skepticism about life after death among many Japanese. Fukuzawa Yukichi, the famous Meiji scholar, wrote about how when he was a kid, he didn't believe in what the Shinto shrines represented, so he stole the sacred object and put in a rock instead. When nothing happened to him, he stopped believing anything. And, of course, this skepticism continues now. You know, who knows what happens after you die? No one's ever been there. Even Buddhist priests tell me that. But even more than skepticism, there is a growing pluralism. A lot of people believe a lot of different things. Formanek and Lafleur have a wonderful book called Japanese Perspectives on the Afterlife. And they show this degree of pluralism throughout Japanese history, but today there's even more. As one Japanese scholar said, as for life after death, if you have 100 people, you'll have 100 different interpretations. That's true. Probably in Spain, too. I hope we can talk about Spain after this because I know nothing about this, but maybe it's similar. Maybe it's similar all over the contemporary world today. Today, ancestor veneration remains, of course, along with belief in reincarnation and heaven and hell, but also envisionings of all kinds of other fates, as well as, for many, a sense of nothing at all beyond the grave. When you're dead, you're dead. Now, interviewing of life after death is interesting and difficult to do. I conducted interviews with 86 Japanese adults in Sapporo, in northern Japan, about what they think happens to them after they die. I did not use questionnaires of large numbers of people, because for this, you can't really do it. If you have a checklist of what do you think happens after you die, I'm reincarnated, check the box. I just die, check the box. I go to heaven, hell, check the box. That doesn't work, because it's much more subtle than this. And there's a lot more doubt in this. So you have to interview people at some length to get this information. But the problem is this strategy means I can't generalize on the basis of age or gender or other social criteria because my sample size is too small. I cannot say women are more likely than men to believe this, or poorer people are more likely to believe this and richer people that. I don't have the data to say that. Nobody has the data to say this now. There has been very little ethnographic data research done on this topic in Japanese or in English. There are many books in Japanese about Japanese views of life after death, but usually it's the author's opinion. There aren't many books that really give a broad, historically grounded picture. 2 of these are Inoue, 2007, and Nakatsuji, 2006. They offer large-scale but non-ethnographic accounts. In English, a lot of people have touched upon bits and pieces of this. I wrote a book in 1996 about Ikigai in Japan. Suzuki, in 2001, wrote about Japanese funerals. Long in 2006 wrote about death in Japan and final days, what dying in the hospital is like. Kawano and Boret both have written recently about new Japanese funeral rites, ash scattering, and tree burial. But these are only a small percentage of Japanese people as a whole. What do Japanese people as a whole think about the possibility of life after death? There's not very much data, and that's why I began this project. Now, in interviewing, you can't ask somebody, do you believe in life after death in Japan? Because belief connotes religion. You know, it's like, do you believe in Christianity? You can't do that. Do you believe in heaven? So you've got to ask a different question. Shindara do naru to omoimasu ka? After you die, what do you think happens? Which doesn't connote religious belief. It's a more neutral way of asking. The overall questions I asked were things like, after you die, what do you think happens? How certain are you of this? 100% chance? 80%? 60%? 40%? 20%? How often do you think about what happens after death? Do you think about it every day? Once a week? Once a month? Never, except the interview? Yeah. If you believe there is no life after death, what do you think will be left of your existence after you die? Is anything left, or are you just like a mosquito? You die and you're done. Tell me your life story, in brief. How does your sense of life after death relate to how you live your life? What do you think will happen to Japan in decades to come? How does your sense of life after death relate to how you see Japan? Interviews were conducted in Japanese and transcribed into English and lasted 2 hours on average. Now, I followed a phenomenological, non-directive method for the most part. That means even though there are many books and manga and movies and so on about life after death, I didn't bring these up because I didn't want to put any ideas in my informants' minds. If they wanted to talk about this, let them talk. And so I tried to let them show me what they thought rather than me pushing them. One question you may have is, did my interviewees think about life after death apart from my questioning? This is a big question. And especially for younger people, hey, here's an interviewer asking me about life after death. I'll make up something. Oh, I believe in reincarnation, I guess. You know, that's a problem. But most people did think about life after death, especially if they were a little bit older, because they'd experienced some death in their life. They had people around them die, and they'd wondered, what happens after death? So this wasn't strange to most of the people I interviewed. They were sometimes reluctant to speak because they had no clear answers. And many times, faced with an interviewer, people don't want to talk if they're not sure. But this lack of sureness itself is of great analytical importance. If a person says, well, I don't know, there's a 40% chance I'm going to heaven, and a 20% chance I'm going to hell, and a 60% chance, it doesn't add up, a 40% chance, nothing at all, you know, that's important. That itself is important. So, let me talk about life after death in overview. Survey data show that 51% of Japanese say that they think there is life after death, a figure well below the world average. In looking at worldwide statistics, the really strange country is the United States, because it's the only developed country where you have 90% of people claiming to believe in life after death. I suspect Japan is much more like Western Europe, where, you know, you have a smaller percentage of people. The developing world has a huge number of people. You know, I've spoken to many Africans and Indians and others, and, you know, it's taken for granted there is life after death. So it varies greatly from place to place. Scholars have claimed that for many Japanese, in their views of life after death, emotional linkages are more important than logical coherence. And I definitely found this. I remember interviewing a Buddhist nun. And I said, what do you think happens after you die? And she said, oh, I'm going to rejoin the Buddha. Then, 5 minutes later, she said, I'm going to be a temple cat. Well, a cat or the Buddha? Which one? And she looked at me and said, "What's wrong with you?" And she was right, because I was looking for a logical coherence that was beside the point to her. She was speaking emotionally rather than logically, and I should have been more aware of this. The pragmatism of Menti interviews is important. An American philosopher named William James said that because we don't know the ultimate meaning of life, we should believe what's best for us to believe. And many Japanese did this. They said, well, I don't know if there's life after death, but my life is better if there is one, so I will think there is one. The most common scenarios the people I interviewed offered of life beyond the grave were these. 1, life after death sensed as communication and communion with dead family members. 2, life after death thought of as heaven and hell or reincarnation. 3, life after death semi-believed in a kind of agnosticism. And 4, life after death rejected as a possibility, except in the symbolic sense of leaving something behind. And let me present each of these. By the way, I should mention, if you can't follow much of what I'm saying now, this will be published in Japan Forum 2 months from now, so you can see the written version of this. This view, communion with the dead, is that there is life after death in the sense that the dead can commune with family still on this earth and can be met after death as well. 20 of the 86 people I've interviewed spoke of communion with a dead family member in some way. This group contained more women than men because women typically take care of the butsudan, the family altar. It's often the oldest female who does this. And this group contained more older people than younger because they'd experienced the death of a loved one and had grown up with a more firmly entrenched familial ancestor veneration. Now, there's one interesting gender issue here. When an older woman talks about, otosan, okasan, is she speaking of her own mother and father or her husband's mother and father? Very often, she would speak of father and she would mean her husband's, or mother and she would mean her husband's mother. And that's because at the family altar, of course, there's the male lineage descent, and especially among older people, this is the way women tended to see this. So I always had to ask, whose mother? Your mother? Your husband's mother? A kind of strange question to ask, but it was very necessary in this context. Woman in her 80s. I'm sure there is life after death. Shigo no sekai. I pray to the ancestors, and when something bad is happening, always someone has come to help me. After I die, I'll protect this family. I'll come and help, just as my ancestors have helped me. Women in her 60s, earlier married to a business owner. When I die, I'll meet my husband, I'm sure. Maybe there really is nothing after you die. Still, I'll meet my husband and my husband's parents and my friends. That's not a religious conviction, but just my feeling. If you can think this way, then you're not so afraid of death. Maybe that's just a way of comforting myself. But it's not just that I want to believe, I do believe, 100%. And she used this word, believe. Woman in her 50s, part-time worker married to a teacher. After my own mother died, I stopped being afraid of death. I began to feel that maybe I could see her again when I died. That's a soothing feeling, a support while I'm alive. Maybe, though, I might simply disappear when I die. No, there's life after death. I feel my mother is close to me. I can see her again in the other world. Human beings are too wonderful to disappear after only 80 years in this world. There must be something more. Man in his 60s, retired corporate worker. When I have a problem and don't know what to do, I visit my father's grave and ask him for help. I really do think that my prayers reach him. Still, I don't know that there's life after death. Nobody knows for sure about these things. Now, communion between the living and the dead through ancestor veneration has been a standard sense of Japanese life after death, based on the ie, the household, into which women marry. This has been examined by many, many scholars. David Plath in a famous 64 article. Robert J. Smith wrote a book called Ancestor Worship in Contemporary Japan in 74. Yanagawa wrote a book in Japanese about life and death and their dialectic. Morioka wrote a book in 84 about the Ie. John Nelson recently wrote a fascinating article on Buddhist altars and how they're changing in the contemporary world. The practice of ancestor veneration I saw tended to be of a very contemporary form. It was not linked, except among really old people, to the ie, the household. Instead, it was a matter of specific people loved, now gone. You know, as you saw over and over again from these examples, well, my mother's gone and I miss her enormously. I want to see her again, so I practice ancestor worship. That was the form we saw, or I saw. Ancestor veneration has been moving from commitment to family and familial forebears to love conquers all, even the grave. And this is a very new development. Now the meaning of ancestor veneration is love conquers all. Somebody you really love, they're dead, but you can communicate with them again. That's the meaning of this. But this still was conservative in implication. The cultural structuring was also essential. Why? Because this love was expressed at the Butsudan, the family altar, or at Obon, the Japanese time in the summer when you go and visit graves. Some people said to me, I practice ancestor veneration because I'm Japanese, Nihonjin dakara. And that's interesting. That never happened with any other form of life after death, but it did happen here. Communion with dead loved ones recalls all the ways that ancestor veneration has been used in Japan to link Japaneseness to the family. And you may know, some of you, if you study Japan, that the Kyoiku Chokugo, the imperial rescript on education, coming about in 1890, was a way that ancestor worship, ancestor veneration, was linked directly to love of country. Hey, if you love your father, you'd better love the emperor too, in effect. And that's what we see here, this ongoing link between this practice and, at least indirectly, to one's country. Many of those who said that they engaged in such communion were conservative in other ways, lamenting the state of Japan today and its loss of heart and the poor values of the young. Wakamono, nani kagaeteru ka, that kind of thing. That's what you heard. Yeah. This is a Japan of commitment to one's primary group, at least to some extent fitting the ideology of wartime and post-war Japan as well. But it's an ideology that's faded in recent decades, just as ancestor veneration in its traditional form has faded. This form of life after death, of a sense of life after death, is giving way greatly in Japan to a variety of new forms. But still, it does continue to a degree. Next, heaven and hell and reincarnation. Heaven and hell, or reincarnation, was invoked by 17 of the 86 people I interviewed. Life after death in heaven or hell, which could be described as Gokuraku, paradise, or as Tengoku, heaven, and Jigoku, hell, was spoken of by 9 people, one of them Christian and 4 adherents of Buddhism, or new religions. And I'll talk about heaven and hell first, and then reincarnation. These people tended to think of heaven and hell in terms of their own fate, rather than departed family members. So this is quite different in implication from ancestor veneration. Social worker in her 40s. I think there's a world of life after death, something like heaven or hell. I think I have an 80% chance of going to heaven, but I've had bad, selfish feelings too. Sometimes, so maybe a 20% chance of hell. But I'm quite sure there's something. We see dead people in dreams, don't we? Aren't those people in a world beyond the grave? Well, okay. Owner of a restaurant in her 50s. Probably if I died now, I'd go somewhere between Osaido, salvation, and Jigoku, hell. Because I've just started praying to Amida. I don't feel that I'll have to go to the deepest part of hell. I think I've been saved from that. I believe that no matter how wicked you've been, if you truly repent your guilt and devote yourself to praying to Amida, then you won't have to go to Jigoku. You'll be saved. I might mention this was a woman who had been a bar hostess and had several abortions. And she felt very guilty about this, and she then turned to a Buddhist priest who, in exchange for a lot of money, agreed to save her, and so on. Doctor in his 40s. I'm frightened of death despite my religion. My religion, Mahikari, teaches about the next life, but still, you don't know. Of course you feel uneasy. Death is terrifying. When I read a book about Mahikari, it teaches that while the body decays, the soul goes to another world. That calms me down. But Mahikari teaches that there may be tough training in the next world. You've got to be useful to God. Am I useful? I just don't know. Reincarnation was emphasized by 8 people. A small number, given that Japan's best-selling books over the past 25 years about life after death, those of Tamba Tetsuro in 1988 and Ida Fumihiko in 1996, have both talked about reincarnation as the path to growth and truth. These books were mentioned by 2 of my interviewees. 4 of these people were active members of Buddhist sects, while 4 were not. Company worker in his 20s. I believe in reincarnation. That's Soka Gakkai's teachings. Some people are born rich, others poor. It's unfair. That's why I believe in reincarnation. But it's not as if you're given eternal life. Each life you start over from 0. I can't say that Soka Gakkai believers will be born higher than other people. Soka Gakkai believers do bad things too. Company worker in her 40s. I think that when I die, I will die, but my spirit will be born again in someone else. If you do bad things in this life, you'll suffer from the same pain that you inflicted upon others once you're reborn. I don't know what I'll become in my next life. I want to be a human being again. I don't want to be a cockroach. Now, heaven and hell resemble reincarnation in terms of a judgment made as to worthiness. But there is a key distinction. Heaven and hell often tends to be based on faith, as judged by Buddha or God. Reincarnation is based on works, as judged through a karmic scale. Now, not always. The Soka Gakkai person did talk he talked about works, but one of the Christians talked about works as well. So you can't always tell. Nonetheless, there is this distinction between work and faith. Works and faith as the way to get to heaven. But both are based in a sort of cosmic meritocracy. You guys have just had examinations, right? Some of you will get A's. Some of you will get F's. Maybe. And that's the notion of a meritocracy. And you can't say, wait, my mother was sick last night. That's why I couldn't study. F. No. And the same is true for heaven and hell or reincarnation. 34% of people go to heaven and 56% go to hell, whatever. It's this clear line of do you pass or do you fail? That's what I mean by meritocracy. And the same is true with reincarnation. Where do you go? It's a judgment of your own personal worthiness. Unlike communion with deceased family members, which is a matter of family members aiding one another, those who believe in heaven, hell, or reincarnation felt that no human connection in this world can help you get to a better place after life in the next world. Nothing can help you except for your own merit or its lack. This individualistic, meritocratic view of life after death brings to mind a pivotal aspect of contemporary Japanese society before death, the examination system. Also, meritocratic pay, which is coming into Japan much more. But as you know, to enter secondary schools and particularly universities, individuals compete for their futures, with some winning and some losing. Half of those I interviewed, who spoke of heaven or hell or of reincarnation, had children who were or would soon go through the examination system that would determine their future. Several of them spoke about their concerns over their children's fates and wondered whether the examination system was fair. As a company worker in his 40s said, whether this system is fair or not, I can't say, but this is the reality we have to follow. Now, this sense of life after death implies a society in which connections mean little. Everything is based on individual works or faith. But while the legitimacy of the selecting mechanism for the world after death can't be questioned, selecting mechanisms in this world are open to doubt. Does one's passage through examinations really represent one's individual merit, or one's willingness to conform to a regimen of examinations that dehumanizes? I mean, you guys too, for that matter. Are you university students because you're smart or because you conform? Interesting question. Reincarnation, as one person told me, is always fair, unlike this world. So that it's interesting, the meritocracy in the next world has to be valid. In this world, no, because we are fallible human beings. My interviewees typically didn't connect the meritocracy of the next world and the flawed meritocracy of this world until I brought it up. But once I brought it up, they recognized it, criticizing the unfairness of the examination system or salary scales, while never, as a rule, criticizing the cosmic meritocracy upon which they based their senses of life beyond this life. Now, I keep thinking to myself, if somebody winds up in hell and thinks they should be in heaven, maybe they will then. That guy's in heaven and he's a real jerk. Why am I in hell? God must have made a mistake. But now that doesn't happen. The next view here is possible life after death. 21 people expressed significant doubt as to whether there was life after death, while not dismissing that possibility. Now, some of these are included in my earlier two categories, so if any of you are adding up numbers, I'm higher than 86 here. These people comprise more men than women, and more younger people than older people. A corporate worker in her 40s. At Obon, we go to my own father's grave. I have to go. I'd feel guilty if I didn't. I don't think there's any life after death. But my father was the type to feel lonely. If there does happen to be a world after death, he'd feel awfully lonely with his grave unvisited. Construction worker in his 30s. I think there's a 50% chance there's life after death. Animals, too, go somewhere after they die. It would be strange if only human beings have life after death. I wonder if we're reborn as aliens on a different planet. Teacher in his 30s. I can't say that I completely don't think there's any life after death. I haven't seen any ghosts or anything, but there have been lots of TV programs about spirits. I'd say there's a 30 or 40% chance of there being a world of life after death. Yes, I do think that world might exist because of what I've seen on TV. Postgraduate student in her 20s. I don't know what happens after we die. It may be heaven or hell. It may be reincarnation. I think about this a lot, and I wonder. I suspect that something must continue. That's just what I think anyway. It may not be true for other people, which is a very interesting remark. Now, these people know that they are only speculating. There has long been a multiplicity of views of life after death in Japan, but today, as we saw, there is radical diversity. The groups we discussed earlier felt that their view of life after death was true for everyone. You know, I remember interviewing people about ancestor veneration, and I would say, what happens after I die? Who will take care of me? Oh, your ancestors will, don't worry. They assumed that was true for everyone. Heaven and hell, that's true for everyone. But these people often assumed that their view of life after death was not true for everyone. So, view of life after death becomes a consumer choice. It's like a choice of Pepsi as opposed to Coca-Cola. How interesting. That's what you see. Members of this group made the suggestion that adherence to different kinds of life after death might wind up to different places after death. Maybe where you go depends on what you believe in. In a young corporate worker's words, because no one knows what happens after you die, think whatever you like. This man hated his job and had other obligations he could not escape. But the world beyond the grave, at least, was his own, where nobody could tell him what to believe or what to do. Now, this implies the kind of society that many young and middle-aged Japanese dream about, but it remains far from being enacted in Japan today. Japan today is a society of cultural individualism. If you go to any bookstore, you see countless volumes of "Live as you yourself want." You know, that's what they're always telling you. Live freely as you want. But it's a society of profound social and institutional groupism, where you've really got to fit into what these institutions tell you. There's considerable pressure on individuals to fit within expectations of company and family. Now, this sense of life after death that I've talked about here seems for some to be a voice saying, in life after death, institutions can't follow me. There have been many recent Japanese books proclaiming, for example, that death is the last chance you have for self-realization. In the world before death, institutions can constrain one. But in death and the world beyond death, you can be free to choose whatever world you may fancy. And that's what we see here to some degree. It's an escape valve, in a sense, the idea that you can go wherever you want to go, according to your consumer choice. And finally, we come to know life after death. This is the view that people die and vanish, except in memories on this earth. 36 people held this view, more men than women, and more middle-aged and younger people than elders. A part-time worker in his 20s. I don't think there's life after death, not at all. I'm too rational for that. Corporate worker in his 40s. Every summer at Obon, we visit my father's grave. I talk to him. Dad, how are you doing? Are you okay? I don't think he's okay. He's dead. But I tell him about the kids. Tell him the things I tell him if he were alive. Corporate executive in her 40s. I don't think there's a life after death. I live as I live so that in the last moment of my life, I can know that I've made the world better. Government worker in his 50s. I respect rituals like funerals, but I don't think there's any life after death. It'll be enough if people remember me once in a while after I die. I forget my parents and feel bad. When the temple sends me a notice that this year will be the 10th anniversary of my mother's death, of course I arrange a memorial service for her. But usually I forget about her. When I die, I'll vanish. I don't feel sad. There's nothing I can do. Belief in life after death is an attachment to life. I've got to sever such attachments. Teacher in his 30s. When I die, I return to nature. Daishizen. I become part of the soil and air and water and serve other life in its growth. In this way, I live on, but I won't be conscious of any of this. I myself will be dead and gone. Now, this is a rationalistic, scientific approach. When these people die, they vanish, they maintain. But they had different responses to this situation, ones that I think of as hedonism, pleasure, stoic humanism, or remaining. A few, often younger, were hedonists. They lived for their pleasures, whether dating, shopping, or traveling. The man in his 20s quoted above said, I don't think there's any life after death. Once I get older, I might have lots of responsibilities, so I better enjoy my life now. His view is based more on the knowledge of emerging adult responsibilities than on reflection over death's final end. Nonetheless, his and others' response to what they see as death's ultimate end was to enjoy life while it lasts. Hey, you die and it's over. You got one life to live, so enjoy life. A second group, often middle-aged, were stoic humanists. A corporate executive in her 40s quoted above said, I live as I live because if everyone lived in this way, the world would be a better place. She felt that she was improving the world through her life. She said, when I die, I want to be able to examine my life and know that I lived in the best possible way. Nothing happens after that. I'm only dead, but I live now for that moment. This view is that although we die and vanish, making the world a better place is why we are alive. Now, I asked her, why bother? And she couldn't answer. And that's the existential question. If you die and you're only dead, why be good to people now? Why follow any moral basis? But I didn't want to push her. Well, A third group, 18 in all, lived for what they felt would remain in this world. The Japanese scholar Takenaka writes, when one is old, one may collect everything one has done in one's life. Some may do this to have one's name known in history, and others from a sense of mission to help others in one's footsteps. This is the sense to leave something behind after you die, to leave something after you die. A calligrapher in his 60s I interviewed joked about whether or not his art would be shown in museums after he's dead. He said, maybe after I'm dead, that guy's work will be in a museum and mine won't. And I'll think, why did they like him? What's wrong with those people? He joked about it, but he wouldn't have joked if this wasn't pretty serious. Why joke about this? A designer in his 30s said, yes, I want everyone to look at my work after I'm gone and say, Nakamura did that. Others view their children in a similar way. A housewife in her 40s told me, I will die eventually, but my children will live on, and then their children, and their children, so I will live on. Finally, one may leave one's physical remains which return to nature. This is true for Japan's new death rites, the scattering of ashes analyzed by Kawano, and the tree burial analyzed by Boret. These represent, in a sense, substitutes for earlier forms of life after death, especially ancestor veneration. Instead of becoming an ancestor and being prayed for at the altar, instead, your ashes are scattered and you become part of the earth. There's a direct succession here, it seems to me, or an indirect succession anywhere, as ancestor veneration fades. Some of the strategies of remaining that I've outlined are based in one's individual self, lasting beyond the grave. The artists remembered through their work, for example. And others are based in one's belonging to one's family. One dies, but one's family, one's children, one's descendants live on. Returning to nature is, in a sense, the ultimate in such belonging. You return to the cosmos to which you belong. These different views all, again, have different views of society. Those who are hedonists, the pleasure seekers, seem influenced more by their place in the life course than by their visions of life after death. But if there is no life after death, then why do anything but enjoy oneself? Their ideal society would be based on present-day pleasures, with production and reproduction taking a second place to consumption and its enjoyment. Now, it seems to me that those young people who enter Japanese established work and so on, those who become corporate workers and mothers following that established conservative view, probably won't continue with this. But what of all the young Frita now? What of all the young people who are not following that course? They may indeed lead these kinds of hedonistic lives. For those who want to make society a better place, their ideal society is one of everyone helping everyone. This echoes the call for Japanese retirees to serve as volunteers aiding society. And this view echoes Japanese social critics across different eras who have urged individuals to sacrifice yourself for the good of society. You certainly heard that in wartime Japan. And it's so often in Japan. Get rid of your selfish, your wagamama self. Instead, give yourself to the larger group. But in a less conservative way, this echoes the existentialism of Albert Camus. In The Plague, for example, everyone dies anyway, but do what you can to help while you're here. Basing one's hopes on one's creative work implies a scoreboard of posterity upon which one struggles to be remembered. This is a society of profound individual competition, but a competition whose outcome can't be known. The artists I interviewed often were completely ignored in real life. But they would say, 100 years from now, people will know my name. Nobody can know. But this is a world where there's a lot of different artists, and who on earth will be remembered? Here in Barcelona, looking at Gaudi, for example, there were 500 other architects like Gaudi. We don't know who they were. Only he is remembered. But today, you can think, I'm going to be one of those people who will be remembered. That's what we see here. Leaving something behind through one's family is a naturalistic form of communion with deceased family members, ancestor veneration, in all of its societal implications. I live on through my descendants not because they will pray to me at the altar, but they have my genetic material. Returning to nature is linked to a vision of society as linked to the earth. Now, this sense has a long history in Japan, and they often talk about Japan as being a society that likes nature, and yet Japan now is a society based on concrete, with all of these natural areas concreted in, as you see. Today, this view has a particular urgency because of looming global environmental catastrophe. If this view of life after death were to prevail, then Japan, sheathed in concrete in recent decades, might possibly become a beacon of environmental awareness. Now, life after death and the future of Japan. Let me finish up here in some conclusions. I have described 4 different versions of life after death or its absence, and various potential future societies linked to such imaginings. Communion with departed family members, although a matter of personal communion, nonetheless seems linked to the idea of family as the center of society. It's also linked to some extent to the ongoing production of Japaneseness. It's the most conservative in implication of any of these visions of life after death, in its connection to ideologies of commitment to family, company, country. Heaven, hell, or reincarnation is linked to the idea of society as a meritocracy, and particularly to the examination system, in its emphasis on individual ability as the basis of judgment of worth. The authorities in this world can always be questioned, while the next world is beyond question. But the ideal remains of a society based on impersonal fairness, in which connections mean nothing. And, you know, in Japan now, people often talk about konne, konne, konne. That's how you manage to succeed. This is against that, in a sense. Agnosticism and relativism concerning life after death is linked to the dream of a society in which people live in their own ways, unbound by social pressure. Consumer choice has become a worldwide neoliberal ideal, and in Japan too, even if Japan's constricting institutions make this only a dream. This is the dream of a society based on personal free choice, including, sometimes, one's choice of reality after death. A sense of no life after death has 3 alternative societal implications: hedonism and the idea of society as a playground for pleasure, Stoic humanism and the idea of society as a forum for working to better the world, and the pursuit of posterity through which what one leaves on Earth. This last pursuit may invoke a society of individuals struggling to be remembered in a kind of cosmic survival of the fittest, but it may also involve living on through one's children and descendants, or a sense of belonging to the Earth and to the cosmos, with many different societal implications, as we've talked about. Now, this is the final point, and I think that the key for what I'm trying to say here. These visions of life after death reflect how those who hold such visions perceive and behave in the world before death. We are, to some extent, consistent in our views. And if a person holds one view of life after death, not always, but often, they behave in related ways in this world before death. As I say here, the same frames of mind that enable particular forms of life after death to be envisioned also lead those who hold such visions to enact them in this world through ordinary routine activities. Praying at the family altar. That's a daily activity for many people, a weekly activity. That's reenacting this in daily life. Pushing one's child to go to exam school to prepare for examinations. Helping a disabled person. Or spending one's money on a vacation now instead of saving for later. These are everyday behaviors that have a logical link to life after death, and often a practical link to senses of life after death. All of these are linked, however subtly, to the day-to-day enactment of visions of life after death, and to the implicit creation of multiple visions of Japan's future. Finally, what I want to say here is that different visions in today's Japan of life after death are also visions of tomorrow's Japan before death. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Mathews. Well, I say that it was an honor to have you here today with us, and it was a remarkable lecture. Thank you so much. We learned a lot. It was very stimulating and also methodologically remarkable, quite provocative with some of the declarations of the informants. So now let's open the floor. So if you want to ask any question, I have several questions, but I prefer that you ask first. Speak in English, in Spanish, in Catalan, whatever you want. So the floor is open. Jonathan.
Hello, thanks for your lecture. It was so interesting. I was thinking, was there any relation between how often these people was thinking about death and life after death? Was there any relation in how many times they think about it and what do they think that happens later? I mean, people who think a lot, it's because they are afraid that there's nothing after death, or?
Curiously, there was not. And logically, you'd think there would be, that somebody who is always thinking about this must do anything they can to be saved. The woman I mentioned who ran a bar, who was a bar hostess, in her case, clearly, that ongoing sense of, I feel guilty, what am I going to do? There was a case. But I had other people who said things like, I don't believe there's any life after death, and I'm terrified. Who didn't, their fear didn't relate to what they happened to have believed in. Much depend, curiously, on how logical a person was in their life. And I think the logicians often felt they couldn't believe in anything and were often tormented, but they couldn't. Whereas the people who were more willing to be emotional or pragmatic in their views were able to believe in this stuff. But that's a really interesting question, and I've not directly analyzed it, but I did not find the more you believe, the more you think about death, the more likely you are to believe or think there is some form of life after death, envision some form of life after death. You'd think you would, but no.
More questions? Comments?
Somebody Bly, here.
Switch off. Okay, I will come back. Marika?
Hi. While you were looking for people to interview, didn't you find someone who said, "No, sorry, I won't tell you nothing about it," because if a stranger comes to me and says, "Hey, what do you think happens after that?" I would say that.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. There were various people who didn't want to be interviewed. Now, the reason is often murky. One person told me that he just learned a relative of his was dying. He didn't want to talk about this. Other people said, look, I'm really busy at work. And maybe they're like what you said. Look, who is this guy, crazy? Why does he want to ask about this? That's possible. It's also true that some of these people were people I'd interviewed earlier on an earlier project, so they knew me. Maybe 30% or 40% were. And so I had a broad pool from that. It's not only a question, though, of many people not wanting to talk about life after death. In Japan, in Sapporo, it's also some people not wanting to talk to a foreigner. You know, hey, this foreigner wants to come and talk to me about personal questions. Oh man, get out of here. You know, that happens sometimes. So you're right in your supposition that probably some people had no interest in this, but I think that was only one factor of many that would cause some people not to want to be interviewed. Of these 86 people, maybe in the course of interviewing, I had about 10 people refuse to be interviewed. So it wasn't very many. We're looking at a small group. Now, I think there's a larger implication to your question that worries me a little bit. How many of these people did, to some extent, make it up as they went along? A few probably did. You know, of, hey, I don't think about life after death, but hey, I've seen a lot of TV. Maybe there is! Wow, I believe in UFOs! Ah! You know, it's possible. Notice I didn't emphasize those people very much. I quoted them, but I didn't go into that. Because certainly there are some people who are more frivolous in this than others. And certainly many people your age. You know, I think people in their 20s often think they're immortal. By the time you get to be in your 50s, you know you're going to die. And so that's going to be a factor too. So the kind of skepticism that you talk about, some people certainly had that. But I think most people didn't. And one reason they didn't, notice how I analyzed here, I also talked about people who believed in nothing. And even people who believed there was no life after death at all still very often had something they were hoping for. Let me give you one example. If you think of a scholar, most scholars at this university probably don't believe in life after death. I mean, probably most don't believe in heaven or hell. But if you ask them, are you going to be remembered 50 years after you're dead? Yeah, I've written this book and it's going to be known. Now, they might not say that, certainly not the people here, but you get that idea. I mean, that's one more form of believing in something that remains beyond the grave. And many, many people have this in some context. It's rare to meet a complete and total existentialist who says, I am no different from a mosquito, kill me and I'm dead and I will be utterly forgotten as if I never existed. There are some people like that, but not so many. And so, all in all, when I give these different answers to what you're saying, I'm not too concerned about, did I only reach those few people who believe in this? Because I think most people, at least after the age of 35 or 40, do indeed have a lot of these thoughts, and a lot of people in their 20s do too. I don't think it's so unusual. If I was doing this research in a really non-thinking place about this, like Denmark or Sweden, it probably would be a little bit different, because my perception of Denmark and Sweden is most people don't believe there's anything and are completely at home with death. I could be wrong. Denmark is the home of Kierkegaard. I don't know. But nonetheless, at least in this context, it was amazing how most of the people I interviewed, just about all the people I interviewed, did fit in with this category, and I think even most of those people who refused probably would have fit somewhere within these categories if I had interviewed them. I'm not sure, but I think that's probably the case.
Barki?
Hi. Do you think we can predict the way we live in life, observing the way we thought about death?
Yeah. Excellent question, and that's the whole problem of this research, actually. The postmodernists say that we're fundamentally inconsistent, that we don't have coherent selves. To some extent, that's true. It's amazing to me how a person can have a belief in one area and a wildly contradictory belief in another and never, ever notice the inconsistency. I saw that here to some degree, but most people do anyway have a certain broad consistency. Now, this is what I've seen in my interviews, that very often if a person would have one belief in one area, one conviction in one area, you'd see it reflected in another. Not always, but in the majority of cases you do see this kind of relation. The broader implication of your question is more difficult. That if I really wanted to do this research properly, I would live with each of these people for 30 years. And I can't do it. By the way, I'm going to interview you for 2 hours and then could I live with you for the next 30 years? You see the problem here. But I would need to see how in daily life people live this out. And I cannot do that. I'm assuming that people are mostly credible in what they say. They're giving me partial views, but those partial views themselves are worth something. I can't really go beyond this. Sometimes I do know some of these people better, and I do see contradictions in their lives. By and large, though, I have to make this assumption based on this research. And if I didn't make this, then the research itself would be extremely difficult to do. But I think your question is correct in looking at a certain weakness in this that I don't think can be overcome. I'm assuming here that people's views of life after death do have a certain connection to their other views, and I can prove that based on my research, but I'm also assuming that this also reflects their actions in society. Whether they do pray at the altar, for example, whether they do help a disabled person across the street, whether they do push their kids to study for exams, whether they do spend all their money on vacations instead of giving it to their parents, and so on. That I can be based on what they tell me, but is this what they actually do? I don't really know. I'm haunted by what one person said early in my career as a researcher. She said, when I'm talking to you, I'm not lying, but I am telling you the good parts of myself. And I can't help it. And we all do that. Anytime you interview anybody, they don't, I'm a jerk and an idiot, I'm a fool, hit me. No, nobody says that. And so there is a problem with interview research, and I do the best I can to overcome it. by talking to other people around this given person, by doing all I can to make sure of the basic consistency of what I've said, also by talking at length, but this problem remains. I'm not saying don't do this research, I'm saying that you can't overcome it at some level. Yeah. Good questions. These were very good questions.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I think we all are having a great time with your lecture. Thank you very much. I think my question is a bit off the topic, but it would be great to interview a person who has committed suicide. Yeah, that would be really interesting. My question is, do you think these people, well, people who have committed suicide, normally tend to think about there's nothing after life?
Yep. Interesting question. This is an interesting problem for Japan research because there are certain groups of people who are hard to interview. Not suicides now, but hikikomori, the people who lock themselves in rooms. You know, those would be great to find out about, but by definition, hikikomori won't talk. You know, I'm off in my room. Excuse me, I'd like to interview you. Go away. You know, you see, that's what they'd say. And a suicide is all the more the case. And I've read a number of interviews of people who have tried to commit suicide and been rescued. But as a rule, those are difficult because those people, they've changed the narrative. And they will say things like, oh, I was really lucky to be saved, and now my life is much better. The person who tries to commit suicide once is rescued and then 6 months later kills themselves. You don't hear about that person, or you can't interview them. So there's a lot you can't know. Now, from all I've read about suicide, most of the people who commit suicide in Japan and elsewhere too don't have much of a religious belief. Because if they did, they would see the act of living through pain as something you're supposed to do. As the Soka Gakkai believer here once told me, if I didn't have my religion, I would have killed myself long ago. But my religion prevents me from doing this. This is why I live. I teach a class called Meanings of Life. And I often talk about how, even though I don't believe in religion, religion's extraordinarily important because it gives you the meaning of life. And if you can believe it, terrific. You won't do this kind of thing. So instead, it's people who are more skeptical and more logical, because if you are skeptical about life, then why suffer from pain? You know, if life is better than 50% good, then the reason for living is clear. It's like a little kid playing in a sandbox or seeing a good movie. You don't say, why am I here? No, you just do it. But if life is more pain than pleasure, then you have a serious reason of, well, why am I here? This is no fun. Well, I'll keep alive because of my parents, or my girlfriend, or my friends, or my future, something like that. You have a reason and you have to think about it. I suspect that a lot of young people in Japan, and older people too, who commit suicide, have decided that the pain in the present is not worth holding on to anything. And it's an incredible tragedy, obviously, when young people kill themselves, and many, many people do. I've read that one thing about suicide is how much it's impulsive. I know in the U.S., when they raise the wall on a bridge by 1 foot, suicide rates go down 50%. As if, well, it takes me 5 extra seconds to climb the wall. I won't kill myself. You know, that happens. One of the most disturbing aspects of current Japanese suicides are the number of people who plan it out. The young people you read about who, think about this. They look for friends on the internet to commit suicide together. Wow, what a sense of hopelessness. That's extraordinary. I try in my research not to interview people who are very unhappy. And this goes back to your earlier question, too. I mean, there is a limitation here. Because I'm desperately afraid of causing greater unhappiness. And, an anthropologist is like a doctor in this sense, do no harm. I probably don't help the people I interview a whole lot, but at least I don't want to hurt them. And hopefully the people I interview do feel more sure of their own thoughts after they talk to me, because they've had a chance to articulate them. But someone who says, I'm thinking of suicide, I stay away, except to the extent that maybe I can help them and talk to them about their problem. And that's happened to me a couple of times. But you see the danger of this. That's an area that I'm not trained to go into, and I'll do anything I can as a human being to help, but I don't want these people to be the kinds of people I interview. Now, your next question is, what about after you die? And if I don't believe there's a heaven, but if there is, it's going to be really interesting. They'll probably throw me out and send me to hell. Because I'll be going, excuse me, how do you feel about heaven? Tell me a little bit. Is this place as good as you thought it was? I'm bored. You know, that's an interesting problem. So after death, I'm really looking forward to dying, actually. Because what's going to happen? Well, here I am. I've done research on this. What happens now? That's going to be fairly exciting. We'll see.
More questions, guys? Don't be scared. Don't be afraid. Professor Mathews is a very well-known scholar on East Asian studies, as you know, but he's very generous and easygoing man. So you can ask him. So don't be afraid.
Actually, I wanted to ask you the same questions, or kind of like the same questions you did to these people, but you just said that you don't really believe, but that you are waiting for. So what do you think that there is after death?
Well, I mean, I have thought about this a lot. My first book on Ikigai was directly dealing with this question of why bother. It seems to me, my personal view is, I'm very much a rationalist, as most scholars are. But we can't know. We have no way of knowing. I mean, you say, come on, existentialism is true. You know, human beings have believed in these fictions of religion, but, you know, as Freud says, it's time for us to grow up. How the hell did he know? And, you know, you look at the churches down in Barcelona, those people, we might be just as wrong as those people. If you're an anthropologist, you have to be a cultural relativist. So how do we know what's right? And so as a result, you know, I can't be 100% sure of anything. Now, a lot of my work now recently has been done in where my next lecture will be about chunking mansions. By the way, my next lecture is on a totally, utterly different topic. I've been dealing with a lot of Africans and Indians and Pakistanis. And these Pakistanis are always trying to convert me. So I've read the Quran about 12 times. And I keep thinking, what if I die? And I find Allah up there. I'm sorry, Allah, I did read the Quran, but I made a terrible mistake. You can see the problem. How do you know? How can you know? You've got these competing beliefs. If I had to have any religious belief, it would be something like, we are emergent. And it is in the matter of human consciousness becoming emergent. Clearly, something like the internet is one tiny stage in a multi-billion-year process whereby matter becomes conscious of itself. And my own rather silly faith, because I don't know enough about it, is if there's a big bang, the universe expands to a certain point, and then at that point, the universe wakes up and says, whoa, here I am, this is pretty neat, what am I doing here? And then the universe contracts, you die again, back to this. And we're matter, this all fits. This is sort of like a story. This doesn't really lead anybody to have any great religious convictions. It's not, God save me, no. But to think that we are only material beings, why believe that? If I believed that nothing I did really mattered, it would be hard, difficult to bother with anything. Yeah. I don't think that's a very helpful way to live.
But what did you think, like 30 years ago?
When I was in my 20s, I thought of suicide quite a bit. Back to your question. I remember somebody left a gun on the counter and of the kitchen where I lived, and just twiddling with it and just saying, wow, right now. I didn't do that, but that's a powerful temptation.
Very beatnik. It's a very beatnik, no?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I was very fortunate that I didn't do that, because one thing about happiness worth knowing is statistics do show that as people get older, they do become happier. It's a very fascinating statistic. This is largely because the worst hasn't happened. And when you're in your 20s, my God, what am I going to do with my life? Most of us, by the time we're 50, haven't had everything turn out good, but it hasn't turned out as bad as it might. And that's a great source of consolation. So statistically, it's shown that. I'm really happy I didn't play with that gun any more than I did. That's the kind of belief I have, really, or the kind of uncertainty. But one thing this does is give you a basic security. And I can honestly say I'm looking forward to death just to see what happens. Now, it'll be kind of interesting if after I die, wham, lights are out. I wonder if I'll have one sliver of consciousness. I guess nothing happens. I don't know. I don't know what happens. It'll be even stranger if one of those earlier heavens is true. I mean, imagine going to heaven and have somebody who looks like Santa Claus, the God with a white beard. Wow, how did this happen? That's going to be truly extraordinary until I have to burn in hell, and I wouldn't want that to happen. But we'll see what happens. And it's all part of an extraordinary cosmic game. Because we can't understand it, yeah, I think it's probably worth looking forward to see what may come. At worst, it will be nothing. And at best, it will be something extraordinarily interesting, as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, among other books, talk about. So I guess I've become, over the last 30 years, an optimist about all this. And the final word about this is, it's better to have something than nothing, as Leibniz talked about. It's better to be alive than have nothing at all. The fact I've been given life is a gift. And when I'm dying, I don't want to say please, I want to say thank you.
More questions? Maybe we have to... Yeah? 5 minutes more or... Okay, 5 minutes more. I love the concept of cosmic meritocracy. Actually, I was thinking that maybe for that reason, the American people, the 90% of American people believe that there is life after death, no? Because America, it's a land of meritocracy, no? At least at the imaginary level, no? And I was thinking, maybe in order also to finish and summarize, it was a very stimulating lecture, no? The double, two issues in order to think. I would like that you give us some words about that. Two issues. One, it's the ideological level and the political instrumentalization of death in Japanese imaginary, and I'm thinking of course on the Second World War, I'm thinking of Yasukuni's Rhine. And the second level, a more practical one. I'm thinking you mentioned Lafleur, William Lafleur, and I was thinking in Mizuko Kuyo, the abortion ritual. And if I'm not wrong, he says that there is a very practical level here because, for affordable cost of money, you can deal with a traumatic experience. So I would like if you can give us a few words about these two levels, just in order to summarize your talk. That was amazing. Please.
Okay. Yeah, very interesting questions. I too love the concept of cosmic meritocracy. The only problem I have is that was the level that my informants least expressed. I mean, for ancestor veneration, everybody could express it. For, no life after death, everyone could express it. But meritocracy was it's a little more of an analytical concept. And so that's the only time I had to push my informants. Hey, might this be true? Maybe so. Which isn't good practice, but I had to do it. Because it's a wonderful idea, but it's not their idea so much as mine, and I had to push them. Now, ideology, you're absolutely right. And certainly wartime Japan is a perfect example of the ideology. The Kyoiku Chokugo of 1890, by 1945, just 50 years later, you had the kamikaze pilots, slamming their planes into battleships saying, Banzai Tenno Heika, and so on. It works. You can convert people this way. What I see in Japan, though, is all these multiple ideologies, in a sense, rather than a single one. So that company, for example, for a long time, live for your company. That was an immortality ideology. You will die, but your company will remain. And of course it didn't. And part of the last 20 years of Japanese history has been the loss of ideologies. I remember one person in my first book said, I will die, but my company will live on. His company went bankrupt in 1996. His company died before he did, So the ideology doesn't last. Family, too. That ideology has given way. And so what are you left? And, the young Japanese who don't enter Japanese society, I profoundly have respect for them because they're saying, hey, this game isn't worth it. And that's a breakdown of ideologies, really. An ideology at the most fundamental level goes back to your earlier question of it's saying life in this society is good and you should follow the adult life course because it's good. And if young people are saying no, you got a social problem. Yeah. And in Spain you do to a degree because of structures causing high unemployment. In Japan you do because a lot of people think it's just not worth it. as well as not being able to. So the ideologies have frayed, and much of Japan now consists of trying to find some new ideology. Many new religions try and creep in and fill the void, but it's rather tough. And it's amazing to me how slow Japan has been in finding these new ideologies. Why aren't there protests in the streets? What happened in Barcelona a few days ago, and Plaza de Catalunya, all the protests? Why doesn't that happen in Japan? When you've got probably a greater structural problem in Japan in terms of young people being able to find a good life. It doesn't happen. Why? Very interesting. So the society has lost a sense of spirit in a curious way. It's become rather grim in a curious way without having picked up. And what one Japanese scholar told me was, what happens is so many people can find their own private heaven-like world in popular culture, in their own electronics, the otaku and all that stuff, that they don't need to have anything else, and that may be true. You don't need to find this. Then what happens when they become 40, 50, 60, when they face mortality? That will be very interesting to see what may come. Now, at a practical level, yeah, you're absolutely right, and I too am quite cynical at how, the priest can buy this woman off just for 100,000 yen. You can go to heaven, 200,000, even a higher place in heaven. By implication, that's what's going on. A lot more money than that, but you get the idea. A lot of this ideological stuff is intensely practical. Companies, definitely you want your employee to live for the company. So instill an almost religious ideology if you can, because the guy will work harder, the woman will work harder. So, even at the practical level, ideology is diffused and it's rather self-interested. That's the reason I became an anthropologist, really, that we must, in social sciences, partake of ideology to a degree. We can't help it. But we can be more free than almost anyone else. Your teaching, I know, and my teaching is based in showing people that most of what they believe isn't true. And that's very interesting. Now, how the hell do I know that? Well, I'm wrong too, but you get the idea. So that ideologies are clearly running throughout for a lot of different people's interests, and one thing in doing these interviews is trying to see these ideologies at work. Now, who here has seen through these ideologies? Back to your earlier question. Maybe a person who thinks, I die and there's nothing, I'm just a mosquito. But that's an ideology too, in a sense. So, back to William James, maybe the most life-affirming ideology is what you should believe in. So, Santa Claus is real. I mean, you see the problems here. It's very difficult. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mathews. It was great. It was a remarkable lecture. Thanks so much for sharing with us your knowledge, for coming to visit us. This is only the first round, guys, because later afternoon we will have, it's at 4, Joaquin? 4 o'clock. It's in the same room, or in this same room. We'll have another topic, it will be a colloquium, but it's open to you guys. And it will be this colloquium on chunking mentions. Actually, Professor Mathews is one of the most outstanding specialists in the field of East Asian studies, in the field of cultural globalization, and he's going to talk about that. Well, just only to say again, thank you very much for this great lecture, and remember, guys, that life follow after the finals. We have today the finals, the test, so there is life after the finals. So thank you so much, Professor.